Socrates was a kind of intellectualist or rationalist, and he thought that for anybody to be an expert in any domain, they had to understand the principles on which they were acting in that domain. Otherwise, he said, they were just like cooks. They had a knack based on kind of empirical feedback. They just knew what pleased people, but that wasn't what you should have. If you understood the domain, you would have a theoretical account. You could make the point like this, that Socrates thought that cooks knew from experience what tasted good, but doctors had a theory about what was good for you. And he already, Plato or Socrates, Plato more, had this tremendous admiration for doctors, because they were they thought at the time, the first people who had a worked out theory of health and could deduce what was good for you. So Socrates went around asking experts in various domains to tell him the rules by which on which they acted. And for instance, in the Euthyphro, which is one of the very early dialogues where Plato is telling us what Socrates did, Socrates runs into a prophet named Euthyphro who supposedly knows what pious behavior is. And Socrates says to Euthyphro, I want you to tell me the I don't know if he says rule or principle, something like that, by which you can tell which actions are pious. Because Euthyphro is turning in his father for killing a slave, which is a very sort of vexed situation, since on the one hand, you're not supposed to kill people, on the other hand, you're not supposed to turn in your father. So, but Euthyphro claims that he knows exactly which is right, and Socrates wants to know the principle by which he knows that it's right to turn in his father. And what Euthyphro does, however, is give Socrates a bunch of examples of things that the gods have done and famous people have done that everybody agrees are pious. And Socrates, and this is the first important move in philosophy, I believe, says, I don't want your examples. I want the rule that enables you to pick out those as examples of piety. A very clever move. But unfortunately, Euthyphro can't give him any rule. Although Euthyphro claims to be able to recognize piety when he sees it, he doesn't have a piety-recognizing principle, or at least he can't find it, and Socrates can't get it out of him, and the dialogue ends, like all these Socratic dialogues, in a kind of failure to find the rule, the piety recognition rule. And Socrates concludes then that Euthyphro doesn't really know what piety is, therefore he can't really be an expert or a prophet. And then Socrates discovers that people don't know what justice is either. Statesmen don't know what justice is, and because they can't give a definition of justice. And this is very upsetting to Socrates. And it turns out nobody in the whole that he finds and questions can give the rules by which they operate in their capacity as experts. So Socrates reaches this famous conclusion that nobody knows anything, and he doesn't know anything either. He doesn't have any rules that he operates on. So that it looks like Western philosophy begins and ends right there, a very unfortunate conclusion that, in effect, nobody knows anything. Socrates knows one thing more than anybody else, namely that neither he nor anybody else knows anything. And that's because they've got this theoretical notion of what counts as expertise or knowledge, practical knowledge, and they think there must be a theory behind it, and he can't find the theory. Well, Plato sort of saves the day for this in a most amazing and sort of outrageous way. The problem is, look, these people behave as if they've got a theory, but they don't seem to have any theory. They can't give you any rules or principles. So Plato says, well, they once knew the rules and principles in another life, but when their souls were put in their bodies, they forgot them. But, and this is the crucial thing, the principles are still there in their soul, generating the behavior, even though they're not aware of it. So Plato has saved the day. It turns out that the job of the philosopher is what Plato calls recollection. It's to get the people to remember the rules, which are already there, causing the experts to have this expert behavior, but which the experts have forgotten. Well, I won't follow it right now, but that will take you right to the computer expert systems people who think the experts have the rules and it's their job to help the experts recollect the rules. But it could equally well be the case that they don't have any rules at all. There's a kind of interesting mistake behind it, which I can put in here to help. This is sort of an illustration of the way philosophers think, both the clever way they make mistakes and then the clever way they find their mistakes. In an expert systems book, a computer scientist named Feigenbaum, who makes exactly the same moves as Plato, though he doesn't know he hasn't read Plato. It doesn't matter. Plato is so pervasive. I mean, he's possessed by Plato, whether he's read him or not. He says, we once had to learn how to tie our shoelaces. And that means, I presume, that we had to go over here and under here and through here. We can't even explain how we do it anymore. You couldn't tell me how to tie your shoelaces. So Feigenbaum says, we once knew how to tie our shoelaces. We can still tie our shoelaces, but we can't give the rule. So the rule must be compiled. It must be in a part of our mental computer where we no longer have conscious access to it. Now, that's the Plato picture. But it's got a mistake in it. The mistake is, consider the analogy. We once had to use training wheels in order to ride a bicycle. And when we started, we couldn't ride a bicycle without training wheels. Now, we can ride a bicycle. Then we must be using invisible training wheels. I mean, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, the fact that we needed the rule to do it in the beginning, and we're not using the rule now, doesn't mean the rule has gone unconscious and is invisible any more than the training wheels go invisible. It means we're doing it in a different way. Just as we ride the bicycle in a different way, I think experts don't use rules. They need rules when they're learning to tie their shoelaces, for instance. But after they've had lots of experience tying shoelaces, what they do is they just know that when the shoelace looks like this, do that. And they don't even know it in the sense of consciously know it. Their brain is just so fixed that when they get a picture of shoelaces looking like this, an action like that comes out. And the rule has disappeared from the story. It hasn't gone unconscious, it's just gone. The only time people ever actually use rules and to explain and direct their behavior is either when there's some kind of breakdown and the situation is unfamiliar, so that they have to go back to the principles that they learned before. Suppose they've got, I don't know, some special kind of very thick shoelaces or whatever, something that makes the problem, makes it impossible to just use the cases that they have all remembered, then they might have to try to go back to the principles. More likely, to take a better example, if you've learned some skill in school, or let's say a skill like driving. You once used rules, say for parking. John Searle has an example of the parking rule. And John used to say that we can still park, so the rule must be unconscious. But then John and I had a little discussion about this for a while, and now he doesn't say that anymore, I don't think, because that would be that kind of philosophical move. But what's important is, if you got into some funny situation where parking was very difficult, maybe you were driving in England and everything was on the wrong side of the street and the steering wheel was on the wrong side of the car for you, then you might have to go back and try to remember and apply the rule. But if it's routine, you don't have to think anymore, I'll get my mirror in line with their steering wheel and then I'll turn 45 degrees to the left or right or whatever the original thing you learned. Aristotle, who was the person who almost saved philosophy from this kind of over-intellectual, detached, theoretical way of looking at things, and who was, as Heidegger says, much closer to the phenomena than the philosophers before or after, said that this view of skill that you get in Plato, which, by the way, is most clearly laid out in the Meno, where he talks about how even a slave boy can be led to do mathematics because the math is innate, the soul still has it in it from this other life, even though it doesn't remember it anymore. All this seemed wrong to Aristotle. Aristotle says someplace that when somebody has a skill, they just straightway do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time in the appropriate way. That's right. That's the highly situational, particular, successful, skillful way to behave. And Aristotle doesn't have any thoughts that this is somehow innate principles that are being followed or learned principles that are being followed, and because there's nothing in the phenomena that would lead one to think so. It doesn't prove, by the way, when you describe the phenomena of skillful coping and expertise by saying that the expert doesn't seem to be following any rules, isn't aware of any rules, that you can't describe their behavior by finding any rules, doesn't prove that there aren't any rules in the brain running the whole thing, but it certainly does do something that philosophers think is important. It switches the burden of proof, as philosophers say. From then on, it's up to whoever is making the argument for unconscious principles or rules to show either that there's something in the phenomena or something about psychology experiments or about the brain that brings in these rules. Aristotle just thought there was no evidence for them and stuck to the phenomena. The interesting thing about Aristotle is that he was struggling to get out from under Plato, but he had been taught by Plato and he had accepted a whole lot of Platonism. So there's always two sides to Aristotle: the side that is interested in this involved, skillful coping, but there's also a side that thinks that we are basically rational. It comes out in the ethics in a way that people write papers and books about have for 2,000 years, a seeming deep contradiction in Aristotle's ethics, where he starts out by saying man is basically a political animal, and the highest thing you can do is engage in the democratic politics of the polis of Athens. And then in the last book of the Ethics, he says the highest thing is detached, rational contemplation and doing philosophy and doing theory, and the highest thing you can do is, in effect, stay in your study and think about philosophy. And nobody knows how to get these two things together. Are you supposed to be out there going to the voting every day as to how to run Athens, or are you supposed to be staying in your study doing the hard work that Aristotle was doing of working out the whole metaphysical structure of reality? And I'm just bringing out the side of Aristotle that I like and that Heidegger likes. There are other people, say Alistair MacIntyre, for instance, who has a much more rationalist understanding of Aristotle. For instance, Aristotle talks about choice and deliberation. And you can understand that in two ways. You can think that he really means that you ought to reflect and choose on the basis of that reflection. Or he could mean something like, it's okay to reflect, but finally the kind of choice he has in mind is that you just do one of these things rather than the other, and it's this final sort of skillful opting for something that counts as choice. I don't think we should get into that anymore. Let's go on. Aristotle carried the day in rationalist form more than not, and in the Middle Ages, but then Descartes brings back the whole Platonic, Socratic way of looking at things in every way, by being a completely theoretical, detached observer, thinking that you can only find out what is really true by taking the most detached, non-passionate, non-committed, non-involved stance. He writes his meditations, he says, when he has no passions, no jobs, he withdraws into a warm room. It seems to say that he withdraws into a stove, obviously a warm room with a big stove. Utterly, he says, with no involvements and no concerns, and then he can think philosophy and really get it right about reality. The idea is that any commitments you have or emotional involvements you have or even practical needs you have will distort your ability to see things in this objective, detached way which reveals them as they really are. It sounds plausible. It's a strong direction in our tradition. So Descartes goes back into this mode, thinks that there is in the mind representations of the world out there, and that these representations are made up of elements, what he calls simple natures, which reflect the features, the isolable features of reality out there. And what we want to do is have an accurate representation or picture or description in our minds of the world outside of us. This whole business of which we all sort of believe now, of the inner and the outer, that there is this sort of inner self we've got, inner mind we've got, and that we have to get that into relation to this outer reality, is Cartesian. St. Augustine started it. He had a lot of trouble convincing people that there was such a thing as an inner self. He brought up after images and pointed out that there are sometimes things that you think you see but you don't really see, so they must be in you. He had a lot to say about the amazing thing that I think it was St. Ambrose could read to himself. Everybody read out loud, apparently, up to then. The idea that somebody could read to themselves suggested that there was some kind of thinking going on privately inside of them, and Augustine found that very interesting. And Descartes is the outcome of that other tradition. The Platonic tradition on the one hand, that there's all this rules, representations, machinery in the mind, and this Augustinian tradition, that there is this private inner space which is the mind, and it's sort of filled with these principles. And so you get the worst of all possible worlds from an existentialist point of view in Descartes, and you get this important new idea that in the mind are what I would call, people call, symbolic representations of the external world. I mean, that way of talking is new, and it will lead eventually right into the belief that computers are intelligent, because they also have internal symbolic representations of the external world. Can't tell a computer from a human being on that point if you're a Cartesian. So Descartes made that move, and philosophers just generally followed along. Kant said that concepts were rules. Leibniz, as I said, says that skills are theories. Husserl thinks that concepts are hierarchies of rules. It gets more and more like computer thinking as it develops, until Heidegger comes along, reacting to his teacher, Husserl, or his mentor. He wasn't exactly his teacher. He was Husserl's assistant. But Heidegger really reverses everything. He is standing on the shoulders of Pascal and Kierkegaard, and I can say more about them later. But it's better on the way we're talking about it just to say Kierkegaard was the first to say that involvement was more important and more basic than detachment. And Pascal already saw that too. But Heidegger is the one who really works this out. In Being and Time, in 1927, he says that theory is a founded mode of relating to the world. And by that he means there is something more basic, which is everyday he says dealing with entities, which I call this involved coping. But every day dealing with things, dealing with equipment, finding your way about in the world, another expression of his, is what we do most of the time. It's what's fundamental to what it is to be a human being. Theory is a very special condition which arises when there's a breakdown of this everyday coping, and we have to become detached and do the best we can. But theory is not sort of the highest thing human beings do, and it's not the ultimate explanation of the everyday reality that we have, and it doesn't underlie the skillful coping that we engage in all the time. Another way to put this is Heidegger had a distinction between the world and the universe. The world, which is this everyday surrounding of equipment like chairs and microphones and books and so forth, all interrelated, is where we normally live, and it's the realest thing we experience. There is a universe of stuff out there, and we can know something about it. Heidegger wasn't against science on my reading of him. He admired science, and he wasn't an anti-realist on my reading either. He was a realist about science, and science did tell us something about the underlying causal properties of things, that this chair couldn't support me if it didn't have the properties of rigidity and so forth. But all of that is derivative and Heidegger would say privative. You only get there by leaving out the vast amount of meaning and reality that's in our everyday world, where we start and in terms of which we have to make sense of everything. And even in science, we have to have an account of how come we can talk about a universe independent of our everyday meaning. He has an account of that. But so, and the next point is, Heidegger also goes against the tradition in that he does not think that we deal with the world by way of inner representations, descriptions, pictures of the world, which we then either get right or wrong. He's very much against what he calls this, he says the distinction between the inner and the outer, between the subject and the object, between my representations of the world and what's represented out there. This is a big mistake. It's a construction, he says, meaning it's something philosophers have made up. And he says it leads to more and more constructions because it always is looking like it's not quite right, and then they have to make up something in order to defend it. And all of that, Heidegger wants to say, just isn't in the phenomenon. That when I try to describe how human beings relate to the world, he says we're absorbed in coping. We are, I think of it like an athlete in flow. Larry Bird, the famous basketball player, says at one point that when he's sort of intensely involved in the game, he isn't aware until afterward that he's passed the ball. I mean, that doesn't mean that he acts like a robot. He's very, very skillful and very, very sensitive. And obviously, he somehow takes account of it. I would say his brain is obviously taking account of a very complicated situation on the basketball court, but his mind isn't even turned on. I mean, he's so absorbed in it that he is just transparently responding to the overall pattern of what's going on. This is Heidegger's picture at the extreme, but generally how we ordinarily deal when we're talking to somebody, when we're walking around, when we're getting dressed, when we're entering a room. He talks about to his students about using the doorknob when you enter the classroom. He says that you don't notice the doorknob, that you're not aware of the doorknob, you are just entering the classroom, you use the door, you go around the benches, but you don't have to have any awareness of them. And he would further say that if the doorknob was stuck, then you would become aware of it. and then you would have some kind of mental, what John Searle would call an intentional state, a mental state, say, of trying to turn the doorknob and believing that if you could turn the doorknob, you could get the door open. All that machinery that philosophers think is basic, and that Searle thinks is basic. We argue about this a lot. Heidegger thinks is correct, but it's not basic. It's what happens when there's a disturbance. What's basic is you don't try, you don't think, you don't reflect, you don't solve problems, you don't have beliefs, you just cope. The way you go through the door and turn the doorknob, or the way you drive, your foot takes care of the clutch and your hands take care of the gears. You can be talking about something else, thinking about something else. If you are an expert, you will simply respond to the current situation in a highly specific way, like Larry Bird, in a very flexible way, and the more it'll be more specific and more flexible and more successful, the less you think about it, the less you're aware of what you're doing. So that's Heidegger's view. He has three levels, Heidegger. What he calls the ready to hand, or the available, is the stuff around us, like the doorknob, that we just transparently use. And he says, the more it withdraws and becomes transparent, the more we can successfully use it. Then he has the unready to hand level, the unavailable. That's like the doorknob sticking. Then there's some kind of disturbance, and then we become a subject with inner states trying to deal with something wrong in the external world. And then, if you think of it this way, if the doorknob were really hopelessly stuck, you might have to, this is a little far-fetched, but just to give an example, stand back completely, give up even trying to get into the room, and get a new theory about doorknobs. To be more reasonable, I mean, you can always, either when there's a breakdown, total breakdown, or just out of intellectual curiosity, step outside of this whole involved getting around in the world and just think about the properties of things. And if you do that, then you're on the theory level. And there's what Heidegger calls a switchover, in which you leave out a huge amount. You leave out the world, in which there's space, in which there are things that are near and far, and you're at the center of it. You leave out equipment, which is seen as good for and bad for various sorts of things, and the equipment has certain places in the world, and it's either in its place or not in its place. And you leave out meaning, where meaning means sort of what good is it to me as I'm coping or not reflective sort of meaning, but things just showing up as making sense to do, and other stuff not showing up at all because it doesn't make sense to do. All that is gone, and you have this switchover where you become a pure, rational, reflective mind contemplating a pure, meaningless nature, and from there you can build a whole new thing, science and philosophy. All of which Heidegger thinks is perfectly okay, as long as you don't make the mistake then of reading it back and saying it was more basic than the world, and it will explain the world, and it was there all along underlying the world. That's, you can say, it's tricky. I mean, you can say that nature is there all along underlying all this stuff in the sense that it will explain it causally. But what you can't say is that nature will explain the meaning of it. That is, that chairs are to sit on, or to take a Heidegger example, that hammers are to hammer nails, nails are to build houses. People do this because they need shelter, and other people build the houses because they have the role of being carpenters, and the whole world is organized by equipment and roles into a meaningful totality that Heidegger calls significance. That gets left out when you turn to science and philosophy, and it can't be gotten back from science, philosophy, nature, rules. None of that can get you significance. That's why significance is more basic. Significance can lead you to science, but science cannot, what science discovers cannot be used to reconstruct significance. In the jargon of philosophy, Heidegger's not a reductionist. You can't reduce this meaningful, significant world that we live in and share to objects, natural objects, following physical laws. You also can't reduce it to mental entities, symbols, following mental rules. It's irreducible and basic and richer than all of these other things, and that's the world. And we are, in Heidegger language, being in the world. When we are coping, we are absorbed in the world, and we only can understand ourselves back from this collection of equipment and other people and so forth. One summary way to put it, for Heidegger, human beings, Heidegger says, are the beings whose being is an issue for them, or something like they have to take a stand on what it is to be, and what it is to be human, and what it is to be me, say Hubert Dreyfus. And the important, that's all already interesting, but what's important and overlooked, I think, by some people who read Heidegger is the only way you can take this stand is through what you do in the world. If I understand myself at all, I understand myself, let's say, as a teacher, I can't just sort of have an inner view that I'm a teacher. Being a teacher is dealing with equipment like blackboards and chalk and textbooks, and dealing with other people like students, and being willing to devote your life to teaching and being involved in that and having a skill for that. All that goes into my identity as a teacher. So I can't even be me without this whole world of significance as that through which I'm able to be me. The Cartesian separation between, or even a Searle who's close to Cartesian, of an inner subject with a mind and a brain on the one side, and the world out there on the other, which suggests, at least in Descartes, that I could be me whether there was any world or not. The whole skepticism problem in Descartes vanishes in Heidegger. He claims he doesn't even want to answer the skeptic. You can't even raise the skeptical question, because if you talk about human being, as he understands human being, there couldn't be any human being except as already involved with other people and with things. And so the idea is sort of, what if there was me and none of this existed, doesn't make any sense to him. For Heidegger, who you are is the social role that you've taken over, either chosen or just grown up into. So being a carpenter, for instance. And you can also, in Heidegger, have a more unique role than that. You can even sort of make your own social role by taking up something from the past in your tradition and making that into a new role. But it's still a role. It's never really you. In Heidegger, just to sort of finish Heidegger before going to Kierkegaard, in Heidegger, what's essential about you is that you are the being that can take up that role or another role, that you are fundamentally just this being that can take a stand on its own being, and that means that you are fundamentally a nullity. In Heidegger language, you're a null basis of a nullity, meaning that the most fundamental thing about you is that you don't have any particular content or identity. You've always got some content or identity because you've already come from a tradition and you've assigned yourself to some role, but you could change that. And the important thing about that is that you can change that, and therefore you can see from that that sort of Heidegger will lead to Sartre, where you are nothingness. I mean, the nullity in Heidegger gets spelled out as the nothingness in being and nothingness in Sartre. But that's not the direction I would go. So let's go back to Kierkegaard. For Kierkegaard, who you are is basically whatever unconditional commitment you've got. Then in his language, sometimes he talks about an infinite passion, Sometimes he talks, I guess, well, unconditional commitment is probably Kierkegaard language, though I wouldn't know quite where to find it. Tillich, another philosopher theologian, talks about ultimate concern. But let's stick to unconditional commitment. In Kierkegaard, you don't become fully a self until you, and this is his language, relate yourself to yourself by relating to another. Now, Heidegger, you can see, got a lot out of that by saying you don't have a self until you take up a world and roles and everything. But in Kierkegaard, that meant that business of relating to another, have an unconditional commitment to another, so that you know that you are the, let's say, lover of Mary. If that's your unconditional commitment, that gives you your identity. Or say Martin Luther King was the person who was going to bring justice to the black people now. That when you have an unconditional commitment like that, lots of interesting things follow, Kierkegaard thinks. What's important to you is what's relevant to your relation to the person you love. Or what's important to Martin Luther King, presumably when he gets up in the morning, he never has to worry about whether life is meaningless or not. What's important to him is the current decisions that have to be made if you're having a protest march that day or something like, or getting people out of jail or whatever the current thing is. Your whole world is organized in terms of what is relevant, significant, important, and that is always what is tied up with your unconditional commitment. Kierkegaard calls that infinite. By that, he means that that's world defining. That is, everything in your world, which is infinite in the sense that it's more than just a finite set of stuff. Everything in your world, everything that could ever possibly come into your world, is defined in its relevance, gets its relevance, its meaning from this commitment. So you have an infinite, you have this mixture of the infinite and the finite, to talk like Kierkegaard. I'm going to explain this in terms of, there are 6 factors in the self. And they are the way Kierkegaard explains what it is to be a self. So you've got to do justice to the finite and the infinite. That is, to having a unconditional commitment to something finite that defines a world that is open to an infinite number of possible significant things. You also have something which he calls necessary. The necessary and the possible have to be brought together. What's necessary for you is that you are now defined as, say, the leader of the black people. That's necessary like a definition, like 2 + 2 = 4. Martin Luther King is the leader of the black people. Then the final set of factors that Kierkegaard uses when he tries to describe the self is really important for the difference between him and Heidegger, is what he calls the temporal and the eternal. The temporal is easy. I mean, you obviously are living day to day in time, expressing this relationship or this commitment or this whatever you find is essential to you. You express it in time. But the eternal, which is the most interesting part, and I guess it's the sort of the religious part, is that this identity, once you got it for forever, for your whole life. That's what is that in that way is the way it's like a definition. You can't just sort of drop the love that you've got or the unconditional commitment. What's unconditional about it is nothing trumps this commitment. It's absolutely certain for you, necessary for you, and eternal in the following way, that every particular moment of your life would normally be up for grabs, and reinterpreted. So when you go to school, you might be glad that you went to Berkeley, and then it might work out badly, and you think it was a big mistake to go to Berkeley, and then it turned out to be a good thing to go to Berkeley, and you'll never finish interpreting and reinterpreting what this event means, or any event in your life means. Sartre has good description of how up to the moment you die, your life is constantly up for reinterpretation, and the only reason it gets a settled meaning at all in Sartre is that you just die at that point, but then it gets an arbitrary settled meaning. That's how you were interpreting it when you died. But for Kierkegaard, it's got this other kind of meaning. The moment that you get one of these unconditional commitments, it's not part of this temporal stream of events that get reinterpreted. It doesn't get reinterpreted. If you ever get one of these defining relations, it is that in terms of which everything else gets reinterpreted. So everything is seen as leading up to this experience. Say by Martin Luther King, he finally found his calling or his vocation. That's another name for this defining commitment. And once you've got a calling or vocation, then everything from then on gets interpreted in terms of it. And if you should ever give it up, then it would be interpreted as complete betrayal of yourself, and you'd be a kind of zombie afterward, like the man in 1984 who betrays the woman he loves because of his when he's going to be tortured and wishes that it was happening to her. And from then on, he's lost what gave him his identity and gave his life meaning, and he feels that he's betrayed everything, and he's just a kind of pawn of the state from then on. So Kierkegaard has this idea that once you get an unconditional commitment, you have eternity in time, as he puts it, and then your life has meaning in terms of this commitment. This raises a whole lot of other problems I think we probably shouldn't go into, which is, what do you do if this person dies? Or what do you do if the cause is lost? Or even, what do you do if the cause is won? I mean, Martin Luther King had a problem when he did succeed in getting justice for the black people. He was sort of lost. He got involved in the Vietnam War, and he got involved in other things, but his sort of central defining commitment had been more or less achieved. Well, Kierkegaard has, maybe I better say a word about that. Kierkegaard thinks that if you live this loss in an involved way, well, there are two possibilities. There's the old detachment philosophical possibility, that you turn your defining commitment into some significance, some ideal. So Dante turns his love of Beatrice when Beatrice dies into his love of the ideal Beatrice, who's in heaven. And he then doesn't have to worry about losing her in this life, and he still has the eternal significance of this relationship. Unfortunately, he loses the finite and the temporal, Kierkegaard says, because there's no way that you can express day by day this eternal significance if you turn it into a kind of the ideal of the love. See, behind this, why I had to talk about the 6 factors, is Kierkegaard thinks that if you don't have all of them in your life, something finite that gives you a world, something that gives you a definition and freedom to adapt, and something that gives you day-by-day meaning in time, but eternal significance too. If you don't have all of that, you'll be in despair, and you won't really be a self. So the question is, what do you do if you lose the finite? Then if you make this philosophical movement, as he calls it, to what he calls infinite resignation, and turn this whole thing into a detached significance and get out of the involvement, then you'll be in despair. The only thing you can do, and he's not very clear about this, I must, just for the record, so people won't think that I'm interpreting Kierkegaard, there's only a few sentences where Kierkegaard even hints what you should do. But he says, when Abraham, who is one of his examples of having a defining commitment, in this case to Isaac, and through Isaac to being the father of the Hebrew people, when he's prepared to sacrifice Isaac, he thinks that, in Kierkegaard language, that by virtue of the absurd, even though he sacrifices Isaac, he'll get Isaac back. This is all very complicated, but let me explain it in. And here's another principle of mine. Don't get caught in the fancy words. Try to find the phenomena. What's the phenomena? The phenomena is grief. If you experience this loss, let's talk about the loved person, in an involved way, don't make a philosophical movement and detach yourself and think about the significance of it, but really suffer the loss, then what you do is you transform this definition into you being the person who loved so-and-so and lost so-and-so, and that still has eternal meaning for you. That is, it's forever significant throughout your life, but you can be open to another defining commitment to somebody else or to some other cause, which doesn't mean that you've sort of contradicted the previous commitment, because you sort of added on to the previous commitment. You're now the person who has loved and lost, say, Mary, but has now loved Beatrice or Jane. So Kierkegaard thinks that what he calls the knight of faith is the only one who, as he puts it, is the joyful heir to the finite, meaning the only one who can have a life that is fixed and stable, and an identity that's meaningful, and a life in which there's always something worth doing, and have it in a way which is both sort of realistic about the insecurity of it, and yet lives in it with a sense that it's secure. In the funny language of Kierkegaard, the knight of faith sees the sword hanging over the head of the beloved and yet lives as if it's the surest thing of all. And Kierkegaard says this is a paradox, the paradox of existence. The important thing is that he's got a view of how to have a stable identity so that you're not nothing, like you are in Heidegger and in Sartre. You really are the lover of Mary or the leader of the black people. You can have a stable identity, you can have eternity in time, and you can understand the risk involved and do it anyway. And if you do it right, with the right kind of involvement, you will always have some commitment, to live your life by. I find this is really interesting and important in Kierkegaard. This is sort of the core truth of Christianity, according to Kierkegaard. No other religion has understood the importance of unconditional commitment, and no other religion has seen, according to Kierkegaard, how you can get the eternal and the temporal, the finite and the infinite, the necessary and freedom all together in one life. I've become so Heideggerized, and Heidegger was so opposed to Husserl that in the end there's practically nothing left of Husserl that Heidegger accepted. He was always very polite in his criticism of Husserl because he respected him and Husserl was his mentor and so forth. But if you read between the lines or letters that Heidegger wrote, you can see that he thinks that Husserl was just Cartesian through and through, that as long as you have this inner-outer, the my world in my mind and the external world, as long as you think that, as Heidegger puts it, there's this relation where I have to transcend myself in order to get to the world, you can't get anything right. So it's not, in a certain way, I don't think Heidegger really learned anything from Husserl. It's as if, what happens, in fact, is that Husserl learned something important from Heidegger. And in reading Being and Time twice, Husserl saw that there was this life world, that Heidegger, that was Husserl's name for it. In Heidegger, this world of everyday equipment and people and things in which we normally live and which is very rich in meaning. And therefore, Husserl incorporates that in his book, Crisis of the European Sciences, which is a late book after he'd read Heidegger twice. And there it looks like Husserl thinks that that's reality and that we're in it. And he even says Heidegger-like things, that this is the atmosphere of our lives, that it's not an object for us. And you think, or one reads it, I think when I read it, well, it looks like Husserl has finally got it. But then he hasn't got it. He makes this amazing move. He says, in effect, that we can still perform what he calls the transcendental reduction. We can distinguish the life world from transcendental consciousness, which means the mind, which is directed toward it, which is self-contained, and so forth. And in the end, what he says is that we can describe the life world because it is really what corresponds to a set of beliefs in us, and we can describe the beliefs. It's as if the world is, for Husserl, the correlative of what's sometimes called a belief system in us. So he's never really got it. He never understood that we were being in the world. He thought we were self-contained, transcendental consciousnesses with a belief system in us that mirrored the world, which gets him back to Descartes. So I don't think that there's anything that I can explain very well. Well, I'll say one more thing, but it's rather technical. The real thing that Heidegger learned from Husserl was Husserl tried to show that logic and the idea that there were substances with properties could be abstracted from our everyday experience of perception of objects. So he had, in a way, the priority of perception over logic and theory. That's what's new. That is what's new, because Descartes still thought theory was more basic and that perception was a confused kind of theory. What Heidegger does is he takes that move in Husserl and he converts it into his version of how we get to a world of substances with properties like an object, this brown, this chair. But Heidegger thinks we get there by the breakdown of our everyday coping skills. Remember, I talked about that. And so he transforms Husserl's story about how perception can be the basis of conception, of concepts, into a story about how everyday coping can be the basis of theory. And that kind of derivation is something I think that he got from Husserl, which is really very important and interesting. But that's about all. The intentional arc is that my experience with things shows up in the look of the things, which then solicits more sophisticated skills in dealing with the things, which then makes the things look richer and as if they afforded more possibilities for action. And there's no place in there, again, for reflection, for mental images. My knowledge isn't in me. My knowledge of the chair is in the increasing richness of the perception of the I don't even want to say perception because that sounds too inner. It's in the increasing richness of my encounter with the chair. Of course, I sort of hesitated. My brain is, when I hesitated, I was trying to think how to explain this. Of course, my brain is changing as I get more and more experience with chairs. Merleau-Ponty doesn't doubt that. But it doesn't, and the changes amount to sort of recording what I'm learning about chairs. But this doesn't come to me as beliefs I've got about chairs, consciousness I've got about chairs, visual experiences in my mind of chairs. This way my brain is changing as I deal with chairs comes to me as the way the chair changes in my world. And that's one of the very important ideas in Merleau-Ponty. And it's very Heideggerian. It's his version of being in the world. He's got his version of être au monde, to be sort of, I am devoted to the world, you could translate that. In Heidegger, I'm absorbed in the world. In Merleau-Ponty, I'm devoted to the world. It comes to the same thing. In Heidegger, the meaning is this social, traditional aspect of the world that I am just socialized and grow up into. There's never any lack of meaning because I'm already taken up into a tradition by the time I'm, just a baby even, and everything already shows up for me in terms of this meaning. Merleau-Ponty has this interesting claim that he says we are condemned to meaning. We can't help but make sense of things. And things are constantly given more and more meaning by us as we encounter them and cope with them. They are not, they don't get into this problem of the meaninglessness of things, because they think that you only get into that if you sort of step back in this detached mode. In Merleau-Ponty, if you just stare at things in a certain way, they just decompose into colors and shapes and so forth, like Impressionist painters can do, and then they become meaningless. But our natural involvement as moving, embodied, coping beings is to encounter things as full of meaning for us, soliciting various actions, affording sitting or hammering or walking. So yes, they are all meaning people, not for. And once you get this involvement in the world way of starting, then meaning will be there. By the way, another meaning person who's got this so clear is Dostoyevsky. I think of him as a philosopher, and I teach the brothers Karamazov. There's a place where, in the brothers Karamazov, Ivan is worrying about the meaning of life and whether he will accept the world or not. And Alyosha says, you've got to love life first and then ask for the meaning of it. You've got to, in effect, Dostoevsky is saying also, already accept your involvement in the world, all the good characters do, and from there you can ask the meaning of it, and you can ask what to do next about it. And there's another place, oh yeah, and if you reflect, you lose your sense of morality and you lose your involvement. There's an important place where Ivan understands his role in the murder of his father and gets ready to go to the police and confess, and he then is very rare for Ivan to be involved. He's a philosopher. He was a philosophy student, that, as Dostoevsky says, and he's an intellectual, and he's the one most in despair and most in danger of the brothers Karamazov, because he's the one who's not impulsive. And when he has this impulsive idea that he will go to the police and confess, he feels good and he's doing the right thing, and then he thinks it over and reflects and says, well, it's late at night, I will do it tomorrow morning. And Dostoevsky says, and all of a sudden something cold came over him, and he goes into his room and he finds that the devil is waiting for him there, and all kinds of bad things happen. But the idea that you live life at its best when you're involved, and that you're constantly in danger of becoming immoral and meaningless if you step out of it and try to take a philosophical, reflective view, is very clear and interestingly put forth in the brothers. For Heidegger, we are in direct contact with the reality. That's how we are, and is by taking a stand on ourselves by way of coping with the things which are just immediately given in our environment and are full of meaning and significance. In a certain way, one would have thought that Sartre would take this up, since Sartre is very influenced by being in time, but Sartre is also influenced by Husserl. And in his first important philosophical book, Nausea, he gets a much more Husserlian view, in which the whole thing becomes the meaning that Heidegger is so clear about and demonstrates so well, becomes all meaningless, because like Husserl, Sartre really falls into the philosophical tradition in a strange way. In Nausea, when the hero, Roquentin, becomes more and more, I guess you could say, psychotic, and gets a more and more detached view of reality, the more he gets at things as they really are. So when finally he is sitting just staring, not doing anything, and staring at a chestnut tree root in the famous center part of Nausea, he gradually sees the the root lose its function as a pump for the tree and lose its colors until it just finally becomes a kind of viscous, meaningless something. And then, according to Sartre, he's finally seen existence. He's seen reality as it really is, completely meaningless, with all the properties and functions have been read into it by us. That is a typical Husserl, sort of our individual way of taking it. It has given it this apparent significance, but in itself, it is just this meaningless, viscous goo. And so Sartre finally, in that book, goes in the direction of saying that a detached, just staring view reveals reality as it really is, and then we see that it is meaningless. I think in a certain way that's right. I mean, what's right about it is if you just stare at things in a way that has no involvement in acting, hasn't even got any active perception like walking around it or going up and feeling it, it will just become more and more just a bunch of colors and finally maybe just a kind of goo appearing and meaningless. But the mistake is to think there you understand how things really are. That's a very unmotivated, implausible philosophical move. And Sartre never really goes back on it. In Being in Nothingness, he has the view that in his final ontology, that is what there really is on the one hand consciousness, which he calls the for itself, which is the source of all meaning, and on the other hand, the mere sort of what is just what it is and has no characteristics at all, the in itself, which is the sort of heir to the viscous chestnut tree root. And the world is meaningful for us because we give meaning. The for itself gives meaning to the in itself. There are elements of Kierkegaard in it. The for itself uses the world, so to speak, to try to give itself some kind of definition. But the for itself, and this is the bit of Heidegger in it, is pure nothingness, is really just nullity, just this source of meanings that has no content or meaning. So Sartre doesn't believe you can get a defining commitment. He thinks that whatever we are is so free that we can constantly redefine whatever we are. Nothing could ever become necessary for us. No commitment could ever be eternal, forever. And therefore, we are a kind of nullity. But, and this is sort of the Kierkegaardian piece, we must have some kind of content. We need to become what he calls an in itself for itself. That is, we need to become conscious and conscious of having some meaning, some content. So all of our activity is understood by Sartre as a way of trying to cover up our nothingness and delude ourselves into thinking that we have an identity, some kind of content and meaning in our lives. But since we really don't and can't have it because we are pure freedom and nothingness, we are, as he says, a futile passion. In Kierkegaardian terms, we're in despair. In a way, he's very Kierkegaardian. If you can't get the self together, if you couldn't get ever both necessity and freedom, temporal and eternal, you'd be in despair, Kierkegaard says, because the self needs that. Well, Sartre says, yes, that's right, the self needs it, needs to have an identity, needs to have its own nature, its own being, but it can't. So life is a futile passion, and we are constantly in bad faith. We are constantly busy covering up the fact that we are the kind of being that needs something which we can't have. So it's sort of secularized Kierkegaard. It's Kierkegaard without the possibility of unconditional commitments which give you eternity. And it's much further along than Heidegger, I mean further toward nihilism than Heidegger, because in Sartre you don't even have the sense that you are thrown into, in Heidegger terms, a world which is already meaningful and has a tradition in which you grow up and in which you can't get out, and that much meaning is never gotten rid of. In Heidegger, it's considered the basic meaning. That's the world we're thrown into. Whereas in Sartre, that whole meaning is called into question as just something we project in order to cover up the fact that there really isn't any meaning. Up to the beginning of modern philosophy, there had always been a view of human nature, that man was a rational animal, or man was made in the image of God, or what else? Well, those two at least, or maybe a social, political kind of animal, but some view of human nature, and from which you could deduce what was best for human beings, because you could see what their role in the cosmos was, and then you could see that they were at their best when they lived in attunement or conformity with this role, and so forth. This breaks at Pascal in about 1670, around there someplace. Pascal writes the Pensées, this unfinished book of thoughts, and he is a kind of super genius in that he really pictures most of the themes of existential philosophy right off. He talks a lot about how we're already involved in action, we're already embarked, as he puts it, and how you've got to be involved first. He says, don't try to believe in Christianity just by believing it. Belief isn't what matters, but act as if you believe it. Go through the motions, go to church and kneel and so forth, and that way you will become a Christian. It's the priority of practice, and involvement is clear in Pascal. But so are some other important themes. Another one is that the self is a contradiction between opposing factors. That it's always been around that the self, or human beings, had a mind and a body. But before Pascal, some people thought the mind was essential, and you could just get rid of the body. It was just the tomb of the soul, Plato said. You should die to the body. They were clear that though we had minds and bodies, minds were what we really were. That's the way theory, for instance, comes in, and again in rationality and detachment. And then there were always materialists and Epicureans and other people who said, no, bodies are what we really are. Minds give us all these kind of superstitions and religious beliefs that make our lives miserable. If we could just get over them and just recognize that we're bodies, we would then be able to live happy, comfortable lives. As far as I know, Pascal is the first to say we are essentially minds and essentially bodies, and that these are not happily put together, but are in a kind of tension. And as he puts it, the self is a contradiction. And our job isn't to resolve the contradiction by saying our nature is to have a body or our nature is to be a mind, but as he puts it, to live in the contradiction, to live in the extremes and fill all the intervening space. That means something like the most important thing for human beings to do is to be alive to the fact that they are living contradictions, and live in these contradictions without pride or despair, as he puts it. Pride is what Descartes had, because Descartes thought we were these self-contained minds that could know the mind of God. And despair is what he thinks Montaigne had, because Montaigne didn't have any belief in God or eternity, but just thought we were our sort of everyday embodied people. And Pascal thinks that we're both, and it's very hard to be both, and that Jesus is the only one who was really both mind and body, both God and humble servant, and lived in the extremes of both, and did it without pride and despair. And we have to imitate him. But now to the human nature. It somewhat follows from this, but you can add a little more. There is no human nature. I mean, we've said that there is this self which is a contradiction, but And Christianity, in a way, gives us an example of how to live with the contradiction. But there isn't any answer in the old way where people thought that we were rational animals or we were creatures of God. Pascal saw that what even Christianity, I think he saw, I'm not sure whether he saw this, was a question of customs and revelation. It wasn't anything that a philosopher could see was our nature. But the important thing is he saw that there were different customs in different cultures, and that they were totally different, and he describes some of them. And he concludes from this that, quotes, "Custom is our nature." That's the beginning of the existentialist view, that depending on the culture you grow up in, the tradition you grow up in, you will have a different view of what human nature is, and there's no right answer to what human nature is, except that we've got this contradictory nature that we have to live and take some kind of stand on it. And we are the stand we take on it. All this is already in Pascal. You aren't just this mixture of body and mind, but you are either the prideful person who takes the prideful stand on it and says you're just mind, or you are the despairing person who takes the materialist view and says I'm just a body. So custom is your nature, and you are the stand you take. That. And one more thing that Pascal said, just to put it in because it's so important, is that the God of the philosophers is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had that written on a piece of paper that he had sewed into his shirt as part of his sort of religious experience. And that means the God of the philosophers is the detached, rational God of Plato and Socrates and Descartes, a God that you can fully understand and who has a kind of rational theory of everything, and we can become friends of God, Plato said, or merge with God, and then we will have a detached, rational theory of everything. But the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is an involved God that requires a commitment from the Hebrews and requires a choice from each Christian as to how to live their lives. And even Pascal saw, and this is only recently something philosophers see, that you couldn't have a clear view of God. I mean, philosophers have always thought that God was the most clear and the most intelligible being, or at least that's one direction that they thought, the rationalists particularly. Now, Pascal's famous story is that the God is a hidden God. We can't get a clear view of God. There isn't what is most fundamental in the philosophical tradition is what's most intelligible. But for Pascal, what is most fundamental is not clear, not intelligible, contradictory. All this is stuff he saw amazingly early on. From Pascal, you go right to Kierkegaard, who again thinks there is this sort of structure, the human self, and Kierkegaard thinks it's a contradiction of these opposed factors. But the important thing is that these factors, which is the self, has to take a stand on itself. And on the basis of this stand that it takes, it will give itself a different nature. And it can give itself, see, the self, in Kierkegaard language, he says, the self is a relation which relates itself to itself. And then later, it's a relation that relates itself to itself by relating to another. But first, let's just do the one stand you could take on being this bunch of factors is to emphasize the body-like side and make enjoyment your highest good. Then you'd be in the aesthetic sphere. Well, first, lots of people, we should say, don't take any stand on being themselves, self. And that's a theme that gets important. They just live in what Kierkegaard calls the present age. They have what he calls spiritlessness. They just do the conforming sort of thing, and they're not passionately committed at all. Then the next stage is you could be passionately committed to enjoyment. That's already a better thing. Then you would be in what he calls the aesthetic sphere. And then the stand you would take on yourself would emphasize the factors that go into the life of enjoyment. And that will break down and lead to despair, he thinks. And then you could try, the next commitment would be to an ethical life, where you try to follow the principles and do your duty and accept your role as father and your social role and so forth. He thinks, and choose everything responsibly. He thinks that will break down into the kind of absurdity that Sartre sees, that if you try to choose everything, you will find out that what you choose is completely arbitrary, because there's no basis on which to choose anything, because the basis is always up for choice too, and choice from nowhere. He also thinks that in the ethical mode, you want to get behind everything and get clear about who you are and get clear about the principles that you're acting on. This is all philosophical stuff. I mean, he's against it. It's despair, but he's trying to give the most internal view of the philosophical tradition and make it as attractive as possible. And he has lots of good things to say about the ethical life. But in the end, you can't get clear about what it is to be a human being. We are just these embodied, traditional, skillful beings, as I would put it. He just says that you can't get lucid about, this is the idea. You have to act out of something that you can't choose, or your choices will be arbitrary. That sort of soil, that sort of given experience out of which you act, you can never be lucid about. And from the ethical point of view, that brings about despair, because the ethical person wants to be lucid about their actions. In Heidegger, this is just taken over as the view that you can't get behind your thrownness, as Heidegger puts it. You already take up a culture, you take up a way of life, you take up an understanding of being that you can never get clear about, you can never get clear of, you can never be detached. Let's say, I mean, a way to get a feel for this, as it is in Kierkegaard and as it's worked out in Heidegger, is think of the consciousness-raising groups where women in the 70s tried to understand what it was to be feminine in our culture. And what they discovered was, you can say a lot about it, that they take a passive role, that they aren't allowed to enter conversations the way men are, that they're allowed to cry and men aren't. But you also see that that's just the tip of the iceberg, that it is so pervasive what it is in our culture to be masculine and feminine. And it's so much a question of, again, practices and skills, not beliefs. Because for both those reasons, that it's some embodied way of acting and standing and moving, and because it colors everything, you can't get completely clear about it. You're thrown into it by being raised in our culture. So, but I was talking more back to Kierkegaard about human nature. So for Kierkegaard, again, there's no nature. You are the stand that you take. And Heidegger grows out of Kierkegaard. It's all where human being is the being whose being is an issue for it. And again, there's no human nature. There are different cultures have taken different stands on what it is to be human, and each person has to take their own stand on what it is to be human. You have to take it without ever being able to get fully clear about the background that you take over when you take it. And in Heidegger, this is the business of being a null basis of a nullity. You can never, there are several things. You can never get behind your thrownness and get clear about what you're taking over. You have to take this over and give yourself an identity, but the identity is never fixed the way it is in Kierkegaard. It never is eternal. It's always up for re-choosing because you're free. And that's expressed in Heidegger by saying you have a certain, his view of death, which is really not something that happens at the end of your life, but something that happens all the time to you, which doesn't, and it doesn't have anything to do really with demise at the end of your life. Death has to do with this business of never being defined by any identity, and never being defined by any culture, even though you've always got an identity and you're always in a culture. And then we get to Sartre, which is just another version of the same thing when he says there's no human nature. But there is, Sartre says, a human condition. That's like Pascal saying there's a structure of the self. It's this contradiction. There's a structure. In Sartre, the final version of the structure, it's very much like Pascal, is again this contradiction that Sartre sees, that we want to be an in itself for itself. That is, we want to be conscious of having some fixed nature. But we can't both be conscious and have a fixed nature the way he sets it up, because consciousness is freedom to give meanings, and a fixed nature would have to be some fixed meaning, but there can't be any fixed meaning. What Darwin showed was that there is something like a human nature. It wasn't planned by God, and it could have been otherwise. It's contingent, but there is some way that our organism works. All human organisms have evolved to work a certain way. Now we would say, you know, there's a DNA code for what it is to be a human being, and it's being unraveled. But I think if somebody said that, I think that would all be wrong, because that's about human beings, and what Darwin and the genetic code is about human organisms, about Homo sapiens, about this animal. And there is such a thing, and we are it, but human beings are something else. They're a cultural creation, a cultural interpretation of this organism. For instance, in the Greeks' time, to be a human being was to be a possible hero, or a bad thing to be a slave or a villain. And so there were heroes and slaves in Athens and villains. There weren't, for instance, any saints and sinners. In medieval times, the self-interpretation of this organism as a human being was that human beings can be either saints or sinners. And then there were saints and there were sinners. That's, people become what the cultural practices interpret them to be. There couldn't have been any saints and sinners in Athens. Not just that they wouldn't be recognized, they wouldn't exist. If there was somebody who always turned the other cheek, they would just be considered a poor slavey slob that let everybody walk all over them. They wouldn't be an undiscovered saint. And there were people in medieval times who were strong and who would be able to lead others and to make everybody look up to them as their leader. But if they did that, they would be sinners because of their pride. They show up at the bottom of Dante's Inferno because they think that they're self-sufficient and that people should admire them and sing songs about them, whereas nobody is self-sufficient. Everybody depends on God, and only God is what you should sing songs about. So there wouldn't have been any heroes in medieval, not Greek-style heroes in medieval times. Those Greek-style heroes would have been very bad, prideful sinners. The moral of this is people create human nature, what it is to be a human being, and it changes in our culture. It changes epoch by epoch. So there's one after that. After the medieval comes the modern, where to be a human being is to be an autonomous, self-organized, rational being who decides on the principles on which they act and is lucid and mature. Kant defined maturity as being a rule unto yourself. And from Kant's point of view, the Christians were just immature because they served God. Kant said that with the Enlightenment, man reached maturity, human beings reached maturity because they didn't have to, they saw that they didn't have to or weren't obedient to a higher authority like God or like the monarch, but that they were their own highest authority. Another story about human nature, which an existentialist says is just another interpretation. Kant says, of course, this is the truth, and it's always been the truth. The other people just missed it, but now we know it. And then after Kant comes the finalist version, the one we're in now, that human beings are beings who are able to get the most out of their possibilities, and the highest thing we can do is invent a world so open and so flexible, and a culture so open and so flexible that everybody can develop and realize their own possibilities as much as possible. Kant, all the others would have considered this outrageous, that we are supposed to either serve rationality or God or the state or something. Steven Weinberg in the New York Review of Books talks about how science shouldn't be looked up to by people to give them guidelines about how to run their society or their lives. And then he says, at least not until the final science discovers the final principles and particles, as if somehow at that point it might be relevant. I don't get it. I mean, it's still not going to be relevant. And there's this point where Hawking, at the end of the Brief History of Time, says that when we get it all figured out, then we'll know the mind of God. And if you knew the mind of God, presumably you'd know lots of important things. But you might know the final principles of the universe, but you won't know anything important as far as human life is concerned, it seems to me. And I'm giving you sort of Heidegger's view on this. Science gets it right, they could know that there really are electrons, and they really have a certain weight, and they really have a certain spin, and that might be very important for explaining and predicting how things behave, but you won't be able to conclude from that what kind of thing a human being is or what kind of life is a good life. And in that sense, science is meaningless. Well, the scientific view will tell you sort of the genetic code and what human beings need to survive and so forth, but it won't tell you even whether survival is a good thing. Maybe it would be good for all human beings to die off. It's not up to science to tell us. Then we find out from our culture what it is to be a human being. And it tells us that it's a good thing to be a saint, or a good thing to be a hero, or a good thing to be mature, or a good thing to get the most out of your possibilities. And science has nothing to say about that. They can't tell you that can't give you any arguments in favor of this or against this, but that's the space in which people live and the space in which they make their choices and know whether what's worth doing and what's not worth doing. And there's just no overlap. That as long as science stays in its place, and the world and culture stays in its place, and one of them is in charge of meaning, and one of them is in charge of, let's say, causal properties, there's no conflict and there's no problem. It's only when they try to get in each other's territory. One way they get in each other's territory is things like sociobiology that try to use Darwin and evolution to tell us about human emotions and human needs. The other way they get in the way, which seems to me equally bad, is when people in philosophy try to tell the scientists that the things they're dealing with aren't real. The whole anti-realist story, which tries to say that all these scientific entities are really the result of an interpretation. I want to say everything else is a result of interpretation. The culture is an interpretation. What it is to be a human being is an interpretation. What it is to be Hubert Dreyfus is an interpretation. But what it is to be an electron isn't an interpretation. It's what you find out when you get rid of all interpretations and do what Heidegger calls the switch over to the present at hand, that is the mere stuff that's left when you take away all meaning and all interpretation. The attempt to use computers to make intelligent entities, or the attempt to give computers human-like intelligence, is very interesting to somebody like me who thinks of themselves as an applied philosopher. And it was just incredible luck for me that when I went to teach at MIT in 1958, roughly, it was just the beginning of artificial intelligence. It got named, I think, in 1957, and John McCarthy was at MIT, and Marvin Minsky, two of the pioneers of artificial intelligence. And what's interesting about it is artificial intelligence itself is applied philosophy. The whole history of philosophy, a certain part of it, a certain school of it, let's call it rationalist, atomistic school of it, has thought that the mind was made up of representations or descriptions of the world, and these descriptions were written in terms of basic symbols which corresponded to fundamental features of the world. The artificial intelligence people, call them AI from now on, the AI people took this philosophical view over from Descartes, really, but Hobbes also had it, and turned it into a research program. In about 1957, their idea was, well, let's find this basic representation in the mind, and let's find these primitives, as they called them. Descartes called them simple natures. That is, let's find the elementary symbols that reflect or represent the elementary features in the world, and then we can manipulate those symbols, combine them into descriptions of objects, make inferences from them about what these objects will do and what we can do with them and so forth, and thereby create something just like the mind, because they thought, following these rationalist atomistic philosophers, that that's what the mind was a atomistic, symbolic representation of reality. And so I got interested in it because it seemed to me that if this was right, then of course Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty were wrong, because they said our basic relation to the world, which is our intelligent coping relation, doesn't involve mental content, mental representations, intentional content, whatever you have. There are lots of different words for this. There's nothing in the mind that's like a description of the world and which then produces our behavior. We just cope with things directly. So, and of course the brain does something, but what the brain does, whatever that is not manipulate symbols according to rules like they were trying to do with computers in those days. Now they're trying to make, parentheses, now they're trying to make brain-like computers, simulated neural nets. And Heidegger and I will have no objection to that. Of course the brain does it in some way, and of course the brain does it like a neural net. And if you put enough neurons together and maybe put them in a body, I think that's probably important too, you could make a computer that was intelligent. Maybe we'll do so in 1,000 years or something. But what interested me at MIT in 1958 was the proposal to do this, make intelligence without a body, without a brain, but just by using symbols put together by rules. And that's only somebody in the West who came out of the philosophical tradition of Descartes would ever think of such a thing. At the end of the time I was at MIT, there was a student, a graduate student named Charniak, who was trying to make a program that would have common sense, and it was supposed to have at least the intelligence of a 4-year-old child. And to see whether it had the intelligence of a 4-year-old child, it was supposed to be able to answer questions of the sort that a 4-year-old child could answer after hearing a simple story. So, and this is how the problem was presented and how it emerged. They were going to use Minsky's ideas of frames, and Minsky had suggested that there was something there, for instance, the birthday party frame tells you that in birthdays, the children have parties and they bring presents and so forth, and we know that as a kind of list of things, and you could give the computer a birthday party frame. This is what Lynette does for millions of frames. So the idea was, you tell the computer the following story. Mary and, it was Jack's birthday. Mary and Jane were going to Jack's. Let's take him a kite, said Mary. No, said Jane, he's already got one. He'll make you take it back. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you ask a child, why were they going to Jack's, the child will know it's to a birthday party, though it's never said in there. It just says it was his birthday and they were going to Jack's. Now, that's the frame will fill that in. And if you ask the child, and why were they bringing him a kite, the child will know it's a birthday present, although it doesn't say anything about birthday presents. The frame will fill it in. But then comes the tough one. It ends by saying, no, he's already got one. He's already got a kite. He'll make you take it back. Now, if you ask the question, what does the it refer to? Does it refer to the kite he's already got, or the kite, or the new kite that he'll have to take back? the grammar was set up so you couldn't just look back and find out. It says he's already got one, that is the old kite. He'll make you take it back. Grammatically, he ought to make them take the old kite back. But every child, presumably even by the time they're 4, knows that if you've got two things like that, and you get if you got one and you get another one, you have to take the new one back. You can't take the old one back to the store. Now, the question is, where is that bit of knowledge put away? It's not in the birthday party frame. Well, there are two things, according to this Charniak thesis. One, the rule, if you've already got one thing, you don't want another one just like it. It's hard to know where to put a rule like that. Secondly, you have to take the new one back. You can't take the old one back. That was their upset. Because where in the organization of knowledge are you going to put that? In the department store frame, in the birthday present frame, in the middle-sized dry goods frame? It doesn't make it's just a piece of knowledge we know. And there's millions of pieces of knowledge, presumably like that we know, which wouldn't be organizable into frames, and we wouldn't know what to do with them. And if you put them on just one great big list, then the relevance problem appears again, even worse. So, and they never solved it. They don't know how to organize knowledge so that knowledge like that is going to be in the right place. But I thought when I heard it, that's just the beginning of the problem. Take the rule, if you've already got one, you don't want another just like it. That certainly, or might apply to kites, I'm not even sure, but it certainly doesn't apply to dollar bills or marbles or cookies if the rule really says everything else being equal, if you've got one, you don't want another one just like it. But this everything else being equal has packed in it the whole knowledge of the human condition in the rules. I mean, you have to know whether, for instance, cookies, if you've got one cookie, you might want another. But if the cookie is huge, maybe one is enough. But then again, if you're a cookie monster, one, it wouldn't be enough. And a whole background understanding of human coping, this kid at 4 already has, and has it in a way which is very hard to understand how it's organized, and can't be captured in strict rules, but only what's called ceteris paribus rules, which are these everything else being equal rules. And then the common sense knowledge problem reappears in the everything else being equal. And it was clear to me at that point that they're never going to make it, that common sense knowledge just isn't going to be graspable in the form of knowing a lot of facts, that it's got to be organized in some entirely different way. And then I think now people are beginning to understand that it'll have to be organized in kind of skill and pattern recognition ways that don't use the computer as philosophers would have used the computer, namely as having in it symbols and rules, but use the computer to simulate the brain, because the brain obviously does it. The brain learns to match whole millions of input patterns with appropriate actions. And when we understand that, we'll understand something about intelligence. There'll still be a huge gap, by the way. I'm not absolutely optimistic about even the neural networks, because they have to take the input that they get and, how will we put it? I don't want to, they aren't human, so you can't use mental terms, but let's use mental terms. They have to take a given input and see it as similar to input that they've already got in order to process it, or take it as input. They have to process it, here's the way to say it, as similar to some previous input. Because if they've learned that input like this, I could draw something on the board of zeros and ones, is paired with this action, and then they get an input which has similar bunch of zeros and ones, but not quite the same, they have to see it as similar to the appropriate previous input to pair it with the appropriate action. And so similarity is very important in neural network learning. But the problem is, there isn't any such thing as intrinsic similarity. Everything is similar to everything else. I mean, this cup is similar to me. It's in the room. It contains liquids, it's warm, and it reflects light, and you could go on and on about how the cup is similar with me. But then the cup is very different from me, too. It's not alive, and it's will break if you drop it, and so forth. So what counts as similar depends on us and our interests and our purposes. And for instance, our bodies. Things are similarly big if they're big with respect to the size we are. And things could be similarly accessible or not accessible given the way we walk towards something, overcoming barriers or stopped by barriers. So my point is, if a neural network is just in a box and is trying to be intelligent, it's going to run into the last of my 4 objections. I mean, it may be able to do relevance, it may be able to store common sense, it will be able to get skills because skills are input-output pairs, but it won't be able to recognize the appropriate similarities. And if it doesn't see the similarities we see, then it will just count as stupid by our account. Well, Nietzsche was the first to talk about the death of God in the gay science, and it means, according to Nietzsche, that a certain understanding of God no longer has a grip on the culture. There are still people who believe in God, and but fewer and fewer. It doesn't sort of organize the culture the way it once did, where cathedrals were the center of things and where reading the Bible enabled people to understand what to do. And the question is, what happens in a culture like ours that has built everything on the idea that there is one creator God, that a combination of Plato's notion of the good, which is the source of all intelligibility, and the Hebrew Christian notion of Jehovah, the creator God, the source of everything and the giver of commandments to people. In this amazing culture, these two grew together in St. Augustine starting it, putting Plato and the Bible together, into an amazingly unified, monotheistic God, and everything in the culture was built into it, as Nietzsche said, so that if that should collapse, lots of our ethics and our understanding of what it is to be a human being will collapse with it. And that, what Heidegger calls the ontotheological view of God, namely the God who is a being, who is the cause and a ground of all beings, that's the God that's become implausible. It's not just the Christian God, it would be the philosopher's God, Nietzsche says. Any sense that there is this unified ground of intelligibility and ethics and meaning. When that goes, where are we in the culture? Well, there are several things that can happen that interest me. When I teach about this, I teach Kierkegaard and Dostoyevsky as the 2 people who tried to save the essential message in Christianity by disentangling it from philosophy and from science. And it starts with Pascal saying the God of the philosophers is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's already trying to get Christianity away from this one source, creator, ground of everything God. But it only gets worked out in Kierkegaard, where it turns out that what matters is having an unconditional commitment, and whoever you have this unconditional commitment for is your savior, because they enable you to get yourself together and not be in despair. And Jesus is important because Jesus is the savior. That is, he's the first person who showed us how to make unconditional commitments. And God the Father just drops out, the ontotheological God. Kierkegaard uses Jesus' quote, "He who has seen me has seen the Father," and says we don't need and we don't have access anymore to that kind of ontotheological God. We've got the incarnation, and the incarnation shows us the unconditional commitment. They're all incarnation people. That's the first way you get out of it. Pascal says we have Jesus. Jesus shows us how to be a human being without despair and without pride, and how to live in our contradictory nature and live it, be most alive to it. For Pascal, you can't be happy, I don't think. The point isn't to be happy, it's to be deeply alive to what it is to be a human being, and not despairing or proud. In Kierkegaard, Jesus shows us the possibility of unconditional commitments, In Dostoyevsky, again, he's gotten rid of the God creator. It shows up in the brothers Karamazov in a very funny way that I don't think anybody else has noticed. Where, for Plato, God was the sun, and that was the metaphor for the God. God was clear, God was the source of all light, and light was like intelligibility. In Dostoyevsky, whenever he talks about God, he always says, what I loved most was the slanting rays of the setting sun. The rays are what's important, not the sun. And the rays are the symbols of the connectedness of all creatures. And what the deep truth in Christianity that Jesus showed us was that we should love everybody, and we should feel responsible for everybody and ask forgiveness from everybody. This is all worked out in the brothers Karamazov. But the important thing to Dostoevsky is that it's a way of life, Christianity, namely this way of life of love and connectedness. And it's not a relation to some being like the sun, sort of outside the world, that you should, that gives everything meaning. And for Dostoevsky, another important thing is that you have to save Christianity from physics and chemistry. Kierkegaard didn't have that problem. So Dostoevsky is very clear that you can restate, and that's what's happening in the brothers Karamazov, all the Christian sacraments, baptism, crucifixion, resurrection, incarnation, all of them get explained in existential terms in such a way that they don't conflict with the laws of physics and chemistry. And Dostoevsky even considers neurons, which had just been discovered, and said, suppose everything we did was caused by the wiggling of the tails of these little neurons. That wouldn't change anything in our world, of the human world, where love and forgiveness and everything is the meaningful thing. So the first hope is that you might be able to save Christianity by stating it in a non-philosophical, non-ontotheological, and non-scientific way, and just save the existential truth in it. But if that doesn't work, then the next fallback position, which Melville, for instance, had in Moby Dick, is to rediscover polytheism, where there was, for Homer, a plurality of gods, and gods weren't sort of real, how will I put it? Well, let's say what they were. When Aphrodite was around, you were in a world suffused by erotic love, and things showed up for you as attractive or unattractive. When Aphrodite was around, Helen ran off with an attractive foreigner, Paris, and left Menelaus. When the war was over and she came back, and presumably Hera, the domestic goddess, was in charge, nobody blamed her or anything. They said, well, that was Aphrodite. She was in the world of Aphrodite. But now we're all in the world of Hera, and she was a gracious host and a good hostess and a good wife, and served great dinners to visiting people like Odysseus. And there was a plurality of worlds, and in each world, people had an identity. They didn't see. The problem is to avoid meaninglessness. If the Christian God goes, it may look like everything is up for grabs. Nothing has authority for us, and we have no identities that we can count on anymore, because if we can't make unconditional commitments anymore, if we don't believe in that kind of eternity anymore, then it looks like the meaning of our lives is constantly up for grabs and reinterpretation. But for the Greeks, when you were under Aphrodite, there was authority, namely what was important was erotic love. Or when you're under Hera, what's important is domestic love. Or when you're under Apollo, what could be important was, I don't know, intellectual clarity or something like that. You can live in these various worlds. In each world, there is meaning. And in each world, you have an identity. And in each world, the God has a kind of authority. And the question maybe only left is sort of, and what is a God? Is a God some special kind of magical thing outside the world that creates the world? No, gods, this is what Heidegger thinks, gods are beings in the world that focus the world. and shine, as Heidegger would say, with such a radiance that we can act in their light. So let's suppose, to take a funny example, that Marilyn Monroe was a goddess in her time. People say that, I'm a sex goddess, but they don't know what it means. It means that she was the paradigm of a certain style of being a woman, and that women could understand themselves in the light of Marilyn Monroe and see how the world would show up for them in a certain way, and they would see certain possibilities. So a god or a goddess was a paradigm case or a manifestation of a certain way of being and a certain style and a certain world that was so clear and so radiant that people could understand their lives in the light of that person or that thing. I mean, Heidegger thinks in his example that the Greek temple did this. It focused a world, in his language, it focused the world for the people for a certain amount of time. These gods aren't eternal, and they aren't creator gods, and they don't sort of explain the whole universe, but they do save people from meaninglessness. Because you're always, if you were in a polytheistic culture, you would always be in the realm of some god or other, and in that realm, in the light of that figure, who could be a human being like Marilyn Monroe, or could be some, for the Greeks, sort of more ideal being like Apollo or Aphrodite, as long as you're in the light of that, your life will have meaning, and you will have direction. So it seems to me polytheism is a possible thing that our culture might come back to. And the hints of it, I think, are in this interest people have in angels. Angels are sort of interesting in that they're not like this ontotheological, one unified creator God. I don't know much about angels. I haven't had time to read books about angels, but I have a feeling that it's a kind of confused grope for a new kind of spirituality in which there will be individual beings, they could be human beings, they will be human beings really, who focus worlds and give meaning to people's lives for a while. And for a while, one, while the people are in their worlds, and two, while these gods have power, and they will lose power, like different generations of gods in Homer had power, and then some new generation came along and it had power.